Okay, so this is an overview of the menstrual cycle. As you can see, it lasts around 28 days on average, and it starts on day 0 with menses. Another word for menses is menstruation, or we also know it as the period. And this is happens when this happens, the endometrial lining or the uterus lining breaks down when the woman isn't pregnant and the egg hasn't been fertilized, and it comes out of the vagina as blood, and in there will be the unfertilized egg somewhere. So this whole first phase of the menstrual cycle from days 0 to 14 is something called the follicular phase. And it's called the follicular phase because it's named after this thing called a follicle. So typically in a girl at puberty, there are around 400,000 of these follicles in each ovary. Here's an ovary over here on the right. This is one of the ovaries, so there's 2 of them. And these follicles contain lots and lots of cells, or there's lots of cells in them, and inside they have an oocyte, or an egg. And from this day, from 0 to 14, this oocyte develops inside this follicle, or this big ball of cells. It's also called a Graafian follicle. Now, in order for that to happen, it needs to have some chemical hormone that tells it to do so. So some kind of hormone has to come to the ovary and tell this follicle to develop this egg inside it, so that it's ready for ovulation at day 14. Now, the name of the follicle that does this is called, surprisingly, or not, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. Now, you don't need to know the full name of it, but it does help in remembering. FSH. And this particular hormone is made in the pituitary gland in the brain. So there's a gland in the brain called the pituitary, and that's where this particular hormone is made. Now, as a hormone, it gets around the body in the blood, so it will travel to the ovaries and cause the follicle to develop. So that's the function of the FSH. Now, while this happens, it also causes this Graafian follicle to produce estrogen. Estrogen you've been familiar with before. You've learned that the ovary produces the estrogen. Well, in particular, it's this Graafian follicle that produces the estrogen. So you can see here that the estrogen levels are increasing over these 14 days. And as they are doing so, the endometrial lining is getting repaired. So it's building up again just for the next phase, so that if there is an egg, it will be nice and thick again to receive that fertilized egg. So you can see here the endometrial lining is increasing. And the estrogen has another impact. It also, when it's high enough, you see when it's gone quite high, it has a negative impact on the follicle stimulating hormone. This means it stops it from being produced, or inhibits it. So that's 2 things that estrogen does. It causes the lining to thicken, or repairs the lining, and it inhibits the follicle stimulating hormone, so no more follicles will develop from now on for the rest of the cycle. Okay, as the levels of estrogen rises, this estrogen also has a positive effect, and put a little plus sign on another hormone called LH, or luteinizing hormone. Again, this hormone is made in the brain, in the pituitary gland. And what this hormone does, you can see a real high peak here, high peak at day 14. Okay, so at day 14 is when this ovulation happens. And you can see over here on the diagram, ovulation happening here. At day 14, ovulation, or the release of the egg, happens. And that is due to LH. So we had FSH up here, we had the estrogen over here, repairing the lining, stopping the FSH from being produced, and then causing the LH to be produced. And then the LH causes the ovulation. So the second thing that the LH does, as well as causing the ovulation, it causes this corpus luteum over here to develop from the empty follicle. So the corpus luteum, also called the yellow body, is this degenerating follicle. and that's where the LH gets its name from, luteinizing, luteum, corpus luteum, luteinizing hormone. Now this corpus luteum does something else as well. So after degenerating, or it starts to degenerate, it releases this particular hormone here called progesterone, and again it releases more estrogen. Now what these two things do, mainly progesterone, is that they thicken and maintain the lining. So they keep the lining thick. It keeps the lining of the uterus thick. Again, you want this to be nice and thick so that if an egg is fertilized, now that there will be somewhere to implant, because the egg has now been released, so it's just sitting there waiting for a sperm. And if it does get fertilized now, it will have somewhere nice and thick to go. So that's what progesterone does. It maintains that lining. The other effect that it has a negative effect on luteinizing hormone and a negative effect on FSH. It stops those two being produced because, again, you don't want a follicle develop, and you don't want ovulation when you already have an egg out there trying to get pregnant or trying to get fertilized. So in summary, the FSH develops the follicle in the ovary, and this follicle releases estrogen. Estrogen, when it's at high enough levels, inhibits the FSH. It also repairs the lining, and it causes LH to be secreted in the pituitary. LH then causes ovulation, or the release of the egg from the ovary. Also, the empty follicle now develops into corpus luteum, which produces progesterone. Progesterone maintains the lining. It also inhibits FSH and LH. Now, two things can happen. Either the woman does not get pregnant, and if this happens, the corpus luteum just naturally degenerates, progesterone levels fall, and so FSH and LH are no longer inhibited, and the cycle starts again. If the egg is fertilized, the corpus luteum still degenerates, but the progesterone levels from there will decrease, but the placenta will take over and make progesterone instead. So the progesterone is then made by the placenta, and so the FSH and LH remain inhibited throughout pregnancy.